On June 1, 2009, an Airbus A330 of Air France was operating scheduled Flight 447 from Rio de Janeiro to Paris. There were 228 people on board. The aircraft departed from Rio de Janeiro for Paris, and the flight proceeded normally. 2.5 hours into the flight, the pilots reported turbulence to the air traffic controller. Shortly after, the aircraft's onboard computer transmitted several maintenance messages, after which contact with the aircraft was lost. Air traffic controllers attempted to contact Flight 447, but the pilots did not respond, and the aircraft disappeared from radar screens. By the afternoon of June 1, Air France representatives announced that the chances of finding the plane intact were almost nil. By evening, it was confirmed that the aircraft had crashed. The last communication with the aircraft was recorded when it was flying at an altitude of 11 kilometers. An automatic message from the ACARS system reported turbulence and the disengagement of the autopilot. 10 minutes later, at the scheduled time for contact with the Dakar controller, Flight 447 failed to check in. The Brazilian Air Force began searching for the missing aircraft, and the next day, the first piece of debris from the plane was found. It became clear that the aircraft had crashed into the Atlantic Ocean. By the evening of June 2, Brazilian and French authorities confirmed that the debris found in the Atlantic Ocean, 650 kilometers from the Brazilian coast, belonged to the missing Air France aircraft. Until the flight recorders were recovered and analyzed, the only data about the aircraft's condition before the crash were the automated messages transmitted by the ACARS system. No objective control data were available, as the aircraft was outside radar coverage at the time of the crash. Initial investigation results indicated that the airliner did not break up in the air, as previously thought, but upon impact with the water. This preliminary conclusion was made by experts from the French Bureau of Investigation and Analysis for Civil Aviation Safety, which published a report on July 2, 2009. According to the report, the aircraft struck the water with significant vertical acceleration. On March 17, 2011, French authorities opened an investigation against the European aircraft manufacturer Airbus on suspicion of involuntary manslaughter. On May 16, 2011, it was reported that the Bureau of Investigation had managed to recover data from the flight data recorder and obtain recordings of the last minutes of the flight from the cockpit voice recorder. All collected data were sent for detailed analysis. On May 27, 2011, the Bureau released an updated investigation report. According to the flight recorder data, the captain woke the second pilot and informed him that he would take over after giving instructions. The captain then left the cockpit, and the second pilot took his seat. A trainee pilot occupied the right seat. The second pilot warned the cabin crew about entering a turbulence zone. A few minutes later, the autopilot and autothrottle disengaged. The second pilot attempted to counteract the roll, but the aircraft speed began to drop sharply, and the angle of attack increased. The captain returned to the cockpit, but by then, the aircraft was in a stall. The stall warning disengaged due to unreliable airspeed readings. For 3.5 minutes, the aircraft was in a stall as it descended before impacting the water. On July 5, 2012, the final investigation report was published. The crash was caused by the blockage of the pitot tubes with ice crystals, resulting in incorrect speed readings. The crew performed inappropriate actions that led to the loss of controlled flight and failed to follow procedures for a loss of airspeed data. The crew was unable to recognize the onset of the stall and, therefore, did not attempt to recover from it. The lack of coordinated actions, poor crew training, and panic in the cockpit exacerbated the situation. The aircraft remained functional and controllable until the moment it collided with the water. The data recovered from the flight recorders allowed investigators to reconstruct the final moments of Flight 447 in detail. After the autopilot disengaged, the pilots took over manual control. One of the pilots pulled the aircraft's nose up, increasing the angle of attack and causing a loss of lift. In such situations, standard procedure calls for lowering the nose to restore proper airflow over the wings. However, this was not done. The aircraft remained in a stall condition for approximately 3.5 minutes. The captain returned to the cockpit when the aircraft had already begun its descent. The angle of attack continued to increase, reaching up to 40 degrees, worsening the situation. The pilots were unable to correctly interpret what was happening or take the necessary steps to recover from the stall. Instead, their actions were instinctive, further exacerbating the crisis. Cockpit voice recordings reveal a tense atmosphere and a lack of a coherent action plan. The captain, upon returning, tried to assess the situation but had insufficient time to intervene effectively. The final data indicated that the aircraft hit the water with its nose raised and a slight left bank. The impact was catastrophic, leaving no chance of survival. The investigation into the crash revealed significant shortcomings in crew training. The pilots were not adequately prepared to handle situations involving unreliable airspeed indicators. Although such scenarios were rare, they had the potential to lead to disastrous outcomes. Additionally, the crew lacked sufficient training in stall recovery. Simulators primarily focused on more standard emergency situations. The investigation highlighted the need for regular training on stall recovery, especially in conditions where accurate airspeed data is unavailable. Following the tragedy, airlines and aviation regulators implemented stricter requirements for pilot training. Standard procedures were revised to better account for human factors in complex and unusual situations. Aircraft manufacturers also introduced changes to designs to reduce the likelihood of pitot tube blockages and the reliance on their data. The Flight 447 tragedy spurred significant technical advancements. In addition to improving pitot tubes, Airbus upgraded flight control software to provide clearer and more actionable guidance to pilots in the event of conflicting instrument readings. Autopilot systems were also revised to maintain control longer in adverse weather conditions. The disaster underscored the importance of promptly locating wreckage and flight recorders after crashes. The delay in recovering these items complicated the investigation significantly. As a result, aviation authorities began promoting technologies capable of transmitting critical flight parameters in real time. This allows quicker responses to emergencies and data retrieval even in cases where the aircraft disappears. The crash claimed the lives of 228 people from various countries, leaving a profound impact on the history of civil aviation. Memorial ceremonies were held worldwide, and commemorative plaques were installed in several locations. Families of the victims played an active role in the investigation, advocating for transparency and accountability. The tragedy of Flight 447 remains one of the most devastating and instructive events in aviation history. Its lessons continue to shape safety standards and pilot training, helping to prevent similar incidents in the future.